All right, well, let's get started. It looks like we've got a bunch of people coming in. So welcome to today's CPH review session. Today's topic is Law and Ethics presented by Melissa Fan. My name's Ashley Mueller, and I'm the Manager of Educational Programs at NBPHE. And so we're thrilled to have you here for another session. If you have any questions for our presenter, please make sure to use the Q&A section so we can address those at the end of the presentation or when Melissa has time throughout. And if you'd like to interact with your fellow attendees, the chat is open to do so. So feel free to put in there where you're from, where you are at with your studying for the CPH, what's making you nervous, and communicate with your other fellow attendees. So a little bit about Melissa, our presenter today. Melissa is an attorney who focuses her practice on healthcare law, corporate law, regulatory and compliance issues, and food and drug law. She advises clients on issues related to Stark law, anti-kickback issues, and various state law issues. Melissa enjoys helping her clients solve multifaceted legal issues, and her clients range from large health systems, ambulatory surgical centers to individual providers. Melissa also has an extensive experience counseling a myriad of clients who managed various operational issues during the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to attending law school, Melissa worked extensively in clinical research and earned her MPH in Health Policy and Management at the University of Pittsburgh. Prior to practicing law, Melissa interned with Judge Michael Wojcik of the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court, worked at the University of Pittsburgh School Law Health Clinic, served as a teaching assistant in healthcare compliance, graduate certificate, and legal writing programs, and worked at a nonprofit environmental law firm. So with that, please welcome Melissa for today's session.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I appreciate you sharing our afternoon. We're going to talk a lot about health law and ethics, a topic that is both very broad, but also narrow at the same time. And hopefully this will not only prepare you for the exam, but will pique your interest in some of the subtopics that we're going to be talking about today. Ashley gave a great introduction to the presentation. What we're going to do throughout, we're going to have the material presented on the PowerPoint slides. I'll be going through some examples. We'll also be asking some comprehension questions throughout the main part of the presentation. And then at the end, there are several questions, one after another, that you'll be able to answer. And those are considered as practice questions. And then at the end, if you have any other questions that you have in the chat that are remaining, we'll go over them with our remaining time. There are two parts of the presentation that I included a 5-minute break, and depending on how we're doing on time, we may either just skip through the break or use that break to answer some of the chat questions. Ashley is going to be monitoring the chat throughout. So with those housekeeping items, we will get started. I need to share my screen. Let me just try to do that. Okay.
Looks good.
You can share. Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. So welcome, everyone. Like I said, this is, I believe, your second substantive session. Let's make sure this is advancing. Okay. And Ashley said, my name is Melissa Fan, and I graduated from the University of Pittsburgh with my MPH. I saw there's another Pittsburgh person in the audience, so awesome. And then I went to the University of Pittsburgh School of Law to obtain my JD. I became a CPH in 2012. I was one of the first groups to go through the exam and certification process. So it was really cool to kind of be on the front end of things. And since then, I've been involved in the exam process or review sessions here for a couple of years, working with different types of groups and individuals prepare for the exam. Currently, I am an attorney at a law firm called Dinsmore and Scholl, which is a national law firm. I work in the Pittsburgh office. I live in Pittsburgh, and I'm part of the healthcare practice group. I'm also licensed in Ohio, so some of my clients come from Ohio as well. I've been with Dinsmore and have been practicing since 2018. Why CPH? So as I mentioned, I was in one of the first rounds of testing and certification. I chose to do it at the end of my grad school tenure as somewhat of a challenge. It was a culminating experience with all the different classes. I was in health policy and management, but the exam covered all the areas. So thinking back to the other domains that I didn't necessarily focus on, was a really good academic exercise, and to learn new things and to meet new people. Obviously learning new things was preparing for the exam, but I've met a lot of new people since then who are also CPHs or who have studied for the exam after I have. And then to stay connected with the field of public health. As I mentioned, I am a practicing attorney. Most of the people who I work with are not CPHs. Most of them do not have an NPH or an MHA. Some of them came to our group from other areas of law that weren't focused on public health. So this is a way for me to stay connected to public health, which is still very important. And it's still very much a part of what I do. And my goal in my practice is to kind of always bring it back to the public health implications and to enable others to consider public health concepts. Okay, so here's where we fit in to everything that you're going to be learning about. So we're right here with the law and ethics section, which accounts to about 8% of your exam questions. So we're going to try to cover as much as we can so that you're familiar with the topics, and then do some exercises, and hopefully the practice questions will be representative. And if something is on the exam that either we didn't necessarily cover in depth, you can take what you learned and apply it and hopefully get that question correct on the exam. Okay, so just a brief overview of the official description of the domain. This domain considers the concepts and scope of ethical and legal principles and their application to practice, research, and policy. It considers the management of conflicts of interest and concerns for health disparities, social justice, and human rights. So taking that description, you can probably see that this area does connect to a lot of other domains. So you may hear me say things that that are buzzwords in other domains, and that makes sense. So some of the concepts that we cover are also very important in social and behavioral health. So there's overlap for sure, both on the exam and in real life and in practice. But this is what we're going to stick to today. A lot of the presentation is going to talk about some current laws, legal cases, and things like that. But just kind of keep that in mind as you go through and you study. I know this is one of your first lectures. Sometimes this one comes later. But if there's something that I say that falls under a different domain that doesn't make sense, it'll probably be covered in one of the other sections. But obviously happy to answer any questions to make that more clear today as well. Okay, so here's a kind of a content outline. I'm not going to read all of these word for word, but the main objectives of the test, they want applicants to be able to identify the key regulations related to policy, security, and confidentiality, and really be able to identify different laws and regulations that apply to public health. I often make the argument that everything comes back to some measure of health or social determinant of health anyways, but what are kind of the major laws that have historically impacted public health? And Ashley can talk about this a little bit later in the presentation or follow up at a different time. But when we say, kind of current and historical laws, like your exam is not going to be testing on a law that was passed yesterday. So, we're not necessarily talking about laws that are perfectly up to the minute, which is why a lot of what I'm going to talk about today relates to things that are a little bit higher level, which you'll see. We will discuss strategies for implementation of compliance, and these strategies can be adopted no matter the size of your organization. If you work for a really small non-governmental organization, or if you work for a giant academic medical center, a lot of what we're going to talk about is going to apply either way. Also, application of ethics to the principles of public health research, practice, and policy. We'll talk a little bit about that. As Ashley mentioned, I do have a background in clinical research, so some of the materials from today are some of the teaching materials that I've used in my clinical research experience, either with clients or with other students, to explain what are some of those concepts. Particularly if you've never worked in research, some of these things can be new. And then we'll talk about conflicts of interest and how that relates to both policy development and in practice, and then the role of national and international health regulations in promoting and protecting public health. Okay, so we apply law to facts. We don't apply feelings to facts. This is a quote from the Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. As when we practice law, we're always talking about what the key facts of the situation are. Are these facts favorable facts? Are they non-favorable facts? We don't apply feelings, but I chose this quote because oftentimes when we look at news sources and we go about our day and talk to our friends and our families and our colleagues and our neighbors, that's not always the case. A lot of people carry a lot of passion related to public health issues. And a lot of times that passion does get brought into the law. So while this quote is definitely an accurate one and a very important one to keep in mind, when we practice from day to day, we have to understand that a lot of these issues that we deal with are truly personal. And when we're talking about public health versus medicine, we often distinguish those two based on the individual versus the population. But ultimately, it does come down to a population as a group of individuals. And so these are individuals who are experiencing these things or going through these adverse impacts or having these adverse outcomes or positive outcomes. So that's just something that we always have to keep in the back of our heads as public health practitioners. All right, so we're gonna get started into the nitty-gritty. Okay, so what is public health law? I obviously get asked this question a lot. But this is a good definition. Very general, but public health laws address the government's power and duty to protect the public's health, and the limitations on this power. So that is almost as broad as it can be. But the way I see it, that encompasses a lot of things. So it encompasses laws. This came up today, but this encompasses laws and regulations about food additives. This also encompasses drug laws. This encompasses gun laws. this encompasses infectious disease reporting. So there are a lot of different types of laws that you may not think of right away when you think of public health law, but in fact, ultimately it does come back to one of the social determinants of health. One example that I like to think of that often is forgotten in the public health law sphere is education law. Um, Education is one of those measures and concepts that we always come back to in public health. And we know as public health practitioners that education is implicated and is a determinant of a lot of other factors. And so laws in this country about education and public education have a huge impact on public health. So keeping that definition broad, I think, is important. Okay, so the first practice question. So a health department received a confirmed case of measles in a 10-year-old. The health department has been asked to exclude all unvaccinated students from the school for 3 weeks to attempt to stop the spread of measles. The county administrator is concerned about excluding healthy children from the school and the backlash from an anti-vaccination organization in the community. Although it's legal to exclude children from the school in this particular state, the health department needs to determine what choice is ethically feasible. Which public health ethical principles are in conflict in this situation? So this is a little bit of a pre-test question. So let's see how the and then the answer choices, you all should be able to see those. And it's a single choice. Building the public's trust versus empowering disenfranchised community members to ensure health access, respecting the rights of individual community members versus addressing the fundamental causes of the disease, or acting on health problems in a timely manner versus maintaining confidentiality of an individual or community and respecting the values, beliefs, and cultures in the community versus implementing public health programs that enhance the social environment.
And we know this one's a lot to read, so we'll leave it open for about.
Yes. And then Ashley, am I supposed to be able to see like how many responses there are, or do you want to just tell me?
I'll tell you, I'll share the poll and then I can tell you which is our largest one.
Okay.
You should be able to see it when I share it.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I'll give everyone about 15 more seconds. Okay. So here are the results. It looks like we've got a little bit of a mixed, but 41%,
Yep.
which is our largest, say B.
All right. Wait, hold on. Oh, there we go. And B is the correct answer, respecting the rights of individual community members versus addressing the fundamental causes of the disease. So before we kind of talk about that briefly, and I'm sure Allison covered this in the very, very first session, that you had, there was an overview of the exam, but just to kind of reiterate with the exam questions, you're choosing the best answer. There are several questions, both that'll likely be on the exam and in this practice set of questions, that you could very much kind of argue one answer or another. But for the purposes of the exam, we're choosing the best answer. So for that one, the school administrator is balancing the rights of the individual community members versus the fundamental causes of this particular disease, which is measles, knowing that there is a portion of students in that community that is unvaccinated. And knowing the epidemiology of measles and how that works, that's where we get the, what did you say? The second one was D, respecting the values.
Yes. Yeah.
So I would say for this one, the reason why I could see, this is a good answer of like what's the best, or a good example of what is the best. I could see why you picked D. I would say D is not the best answer because of the emphasis in D on public health programs, because in this case it's not really a public health program. And then like the key to this question is the um is the choice and the conflict that is the rights versus the fundamental cause of the disease. Oh, let me see. We can go back to the for this one, we can go back to the STEM for a minute. I know this one was a longer one.
Yeah. I can share the results too, so you can see it all at once.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a better way to do it.
Yeah.
They're not all this long. So,
Right.
yeah, they're not all this long. But for purposes of the exam, you will see questions that are like similar length as this. And then there'll be questions that are significantly shorter as well. And some of them in this session there's a variety.
Yeah. And the law and ethics, because you're trying to give us like an example, that's why they're a little bit longer.
Yeah, like the STEM is a little bit longer than otherwise. So all right, so we can, there's similar questions too, that we can kind of, go back to this, and then if there's questions, we can address it during like that first breaking point. So some of this may be review for a lot of folks. If you paid attention in high school civics class, or if that was something you were very passionate about, this will be review, but it's always good to review how different levels of government work and what their role is. And we're going to talk about the interplay of of these different levels of government. So I'm going to try to sprinkle in some current event or semi-current event samples so that you can, kind of make those connections, and hopefully that'll facilitate some understanding of the material. So the levels of government that are very important, and they all have their own role in public health. So these levels of government are the same no matter what type of law you're talking about. But in public health, they're very distinct. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. One of my examples that we're going to go through this presentation is specific to my county. So I'm in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh specifically, which is Allegheny County, and we're going to talk about that. Some states are similar to Pennsylvania and some aren't, and we'll talk about that. And you can, in the back of your mind, think about your state and where your state falls in this. And then you'll be able to, after this presentation, go through examples in the news and be able to point to different things and how those policies are impacted by each level. So we obviously have the federal level. We have state government and we have local government. So for the federal government, we're talking about the main, executive branch, making a lot of the regulations that impact various aspects of our lives. Very, very important things being done at the federal level, both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch. State level government. State level government in public health in a lot of states is where most of the action happens. From the state level, you get a lot of your regulations regarding licensing of various health professionals. Um, you you also get a lot of laws that are related to um, privacy, reproductive health. Some of those come from the state level as well. And then local government. Local government plays a pretty significant role in public health in a lot of places when it comes to things like zoning, um, things that relate to building codes and pollution. Some of that can come from the local level as well. With respect to health departments are essentially run by the state, but in some states, the health department responsibilities are delegated to the local level. So in my state, in Pennsylvania, a lot of the health department obligations are delegated to the county health departments. And so I live in Allegheny County, and we have a very decentralized health department system. So as you can see, you'll see an example in the presentation, but um, the county health department does a lot of the day-to-day activities. Um, and our county health department is a very well-run enterprise. It's very well funded, very well staffed, and you can see that that type of health department is very different from other health departments that maybe they service like 5 counties that are spread out, over half the state. So some states are like that too, where they have like a centralized state health department, but then kind of 2 decentralized units that serve like half the state. And it works a little bit differently than Allegheny County. So, in any event, just wanted to make sure people don't forget about the impact of local government. Um, One of the sayings that we always talk about, all politics is local, particularly when it comes to um, the off-year elections. Um, a lot of your day-to-day impacts, both personally and with respect to public health, really come down to local level decisions. Okay. So this practice question, we're going to kind of talk through a little bit. We'll still do a poll, Ashley, but we can kind of talk through it.
Okay.
Um, which source of United States law gives the power to health departments? So A, treaties, B, statutes, C, regulations, and D, common law. So we'll kind of talk through this together. If people want to put their answers into the poll while I'm talking through the answer choices, um, you can do that, but we'll kind of use this as a teaching question. So when we use the word treaties, we're generally talking about international agreements. Um, so agreements between one or more different countries. Um, there's, lots of information out there about how international law is formed and things like that. So, that's what, if you see the word treaties, that's what that's referring to specifically. If we see the word statutes, that's referring to the legislation that was passed by either Congress or by the state level legislator, or technically that word could also refer to um, that legislation passed at the local level. When we see the word regulations, we're referring to the provisions that are promulgated by the executive branch. And again, that could be the executive branch at the federal level or the executive branch at the state level. Um, and then for D, when we say common law, what we're referring to there, um, that that is the opinions from the federal courts or the state courts that that are essentially, opining on the laws that have been passed by the respective legislatures. Okay.
So share the results.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
It looks like 53% said regulations.
Okay. So this one is statutes. So this is why I kind of want to talk through this one. This one's a little bit confusing. So each health department in each state is specifically authorized by a statute in that particular state. So, like in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Health Department and every other agency in Pennsylvania is authorized by a statute. A lot of these statutes are super old. They've been essentially on the books forever, but that's how the administrative agencies are formed, is they're authorized under the statute. And then once they are formed, they do have a broad level, generally, of interpretive powers. And then those agencies then promulgate the regulations that are to be followed by the other entities or other sub-agencies. Okay. So the US Constitution and federal public health powers. So the US Constitution is the ultimate source of public health power, which differs from the previous question because the previous question was about health departments. And so when we're talking about where does the general public health power come in, that's what we're going to talk about now. So, that can come in two ways, in several ways rather. But the government has the power to promote and provide for the general welfare of its people, which that term welfare has been understood and interpreted to encompass health and public health. Also, several of our public health related regulations come from the Commerce Clause, which is the power to regulate interstate commerce. Even one of the we're going to talk about HIPAA today. And so even HIPAA really is a product of the Commerce Clause. All of the food and drug laws that we interact with, that were some of which we're going to talk about today, those all come from the Commerce Clause as well. The power to tax and spend, we saw this play out in the Affordable Care Act debate. The way that the Affordable Care Act was able to stand was that it created an obligation that essentially was a tax. And so we saw this play out in real time during that debate. The necessary and proper clause, which isn't utilized as much, but Commerce has the power to make laws to help carry out its listed powers, and the supremacy clause, that the federal law prevails over the state law. And so the supremacy clause does come in, particularly as an example, this comes in health law, are the debates surrounding the scheduling of marijuana or THC. So we have several states right now. I think it may actually be more than 25 as of, I think Ohio is the most recent, that have legalized the recreational use of marijuana. And so, however, there's a disconnect because at the federal level, it's still a scheduled drug. And so ultimately, even though these states have legalized recreational marijuana, it's still, based on federal law, illegal. So there are still implications with respect to applying to jobs, applying to college, things like that, that can be implicated by by use of recreational marijuana. So there have been some recent efforts to mitigate that and to bridge that potential gap, but that's an issue of the supremacy clause playing out in practice with the marijuana debate. And I don't necessarily think that that debate is going to be over, but we'll see, kind of where this goes. Okay. The concept of federalism. So in areas where the federal government seeks a uniform approach or policy, Congress may pass legislation for the state to adopt. So this kind of goes back to the supremacy clause and what the states can do when it comes to a particular issue. So when the state passes legislation that is contradictory to what the federal government has passed, we have to determine if the federal government was legislating in that narrow part of the particular area, or whether or not to determine whether or not that state law provision is in conflict. So that's where that issue comes in most often and how that comes into play. We see this a lot with respect to like Medicaid policy. Medicaid has developed a waiver program that addresses this issue, and Medicaid has kind of become a the poster child for navigating different state and federal kind of laws and priorities. But when you hear federalism, that's what we're talking about, and that's kind of the debate that's going on. Like, you'll hear the question of, did Congress specifically speak to this issue? And that's what we're referring to. Okay, so we talked about the different levels of government: federal, state, and local. Now we're gonna go over the different branches of government. Again, this is going to be a review, but the purpose of this session is to think about how this implicates public health. So the legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch implements the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. And each state has its own legislative, executive, and judicial branch. So I want to talk a little bit about the state legislative branches. And some of you may have talked about this during your coursework, but I want to emphasize this because this comes up more often in practice than I ever thought it would when I was in school. So each state has its own legislative branch with its own schedule and priorities. So we think of the federal legislative branch, so the House and the Senate, and we think of those different, those two entities as like a full-time entity. They're always working. You vote for your senator, and that's their full-time job. They're completely dedicated to being a senator, and they're a complete professional entity. It doesn't work like that necessarily on the state level in every state. There are some states that have what we informally refer to as quote unquote very professional legislatures, and some that don't. And while that doesn't seem like a big difference, maybe, for example, in Pennsylvania, if my legislature is in session for 9 out of 12 months, that doesn't seem like a big difference. But there are some states where the legislators they're only in session for a few months. And so that makes a huge difference when it comes to policy work and agenda setting, and what things are prioritized and when. For example, we do a lot of work in West Virginia, and their legislature only meets for a couple of months. So it's a very busy couple of months. But if you don't get your issue on the agenda at the beginning of the session, it's not happening for another year. So several issues will completely die because they weren't put on the agenda for whatever reason. Maybe they weren't put on the agenda because no one pushed for them. Maybe they weren't put on the agenda because they didn't exist at the time. But because there's other things on the agenda, they get pushed for a full calendar year. And as you can imagine, maybe interest has fizzled. Maybe the national priorities have shifted by that time, by the time they get back to session. So think about that when you think about the legislative branch. We're not just, we're not always talking about the senators that you see on TV who are like always working, who have like 10 staff members who are working full time. Every state, it does not look like that. So if if you're going to be moving to a different state when you practice, um, think of maybe do some research about like how does your state run? Does your state, look more like New York or Massachusetts where they have a, 12 months out of the year, 11 months out of the year, their legislature meets, or does it look more like West Virginia where they meet for a very short period of time? And so we're going to talk about the executive branch when we talk about one of our examples, which is HIPAA, and then we'll talk about the judicial branch as well, which has gotten a lot more attention recently as a lot of public health related cases have come before the judicial branch, but that ebbs and flows over time. Okay, so we kind of covered this a little bit, but the laws and legislation, they are the system of the rules created for the protection or the promotion of community health produced by the legislature. Now, with that being said, obviously the legislation themselves can have a positive or an impact or a positive or a negative impact on public health. It's not always positive, as we know. The regulations are then the set of rules that describe the implementation of the legislation, and those are produced by the executive branch. So as we, some of you may have done some of your own research in various capacities, and you've had to look up a law, and you go and you pull it up online, and some of them are really long, some of them are hundreds of pages, but some of them are pretty short, maybe 15 pages, some even shorter. And it seems pretty digestible. And then when you get to the regulations, that's where a lot of the information is. So oftentimes the law, let's say you print it out, say maybe it's 2 pages. And the regulations are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of single spaced pages. And they are very, very dense, and they can be very difficult to read. I did see a question in the chat that I want to talk about now. Somebody asked about executive orders. So executive orders are technically not regulations. They obviously come from the executive branch. So for regulations, there's something called the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs the rules for the regulations. And so with that means that when one of the executive agencies promulgates or produces a set of rules, there's a time frame that the rules have to be out there essentially for various stakeholders to make comments about. That's called the notice and comment period. And so that period, which is usually 60 days, the notice and comment period is an opportunity for stakeholders to make kind of written suggestions or support or just flat out criticism for the proposed regulations. And they can come in various forms. And then after that, the regulation will be considered final. So that's for regulation, whereas executive orders are usually effective immediately and not and not subject to the Administrative Procedures Act. And the executive orders usually fall under, they don't necessarily fall strictly within any of the kind of regulatory schemes, or they are to address something that's more urgent, if that makes sense. All right, so hopefully that is kind of a good sense, because that's come up also as well, these executive orders, which are more common, obviously, when the administration changes. So we're likely to see several of those next week. So it's good that we're talking about this now so you can know what that means. Now, executive orders are also subject to judicial review. So the judiciary can also say that that executive order is unconstitutional for whatever reason. So it's not, the executive orders aren't necessarily a pass to sort of override the regulatory process in any sense as well. So if an executive order directly conflicts with some type of legislation, the court can strike down and restrict that executive order. Laws are like sausages. It is better not to see them being made. So very true from our friends that have worked in the legislature. There's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes on with the laws. There's a lot of stakeholder interaction. I've been on the stakeholder side for various issues. When a law is being proposed, stakeholder groups will make their presentation. Either that could be in person, that could be advocacy letters, that could be coming in and providing formal testimony before the legislative body. That could be in the form of all kinds of different things. When we're talking about public health, it's important to recognize the stakeholders that impact our area the most. In our area, we need to understand that some of our provider interest groups are very, very active and very important in your particular state. So, I encourage you, once you figure out what state you're going to end up landing in, find out who those groups are, what they advocate for, and how they impact the process. Patient groups are also pretty important advocacy groups in our area. And then, we obviously have the big ones. We have the big health systems. We have the pharma groups. But sometimes there are groups that are kind of not necessarily usual suspects in the healthcare space that come into play. So just kind of thinking about that. Sometimes it's a prominent individual that had a health condition, and then that area kind of gains momentum. But just thinking about that, so that's what this quote is talking about. Is there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that we don't necessarily always see. Okay, so the rulemaking process, we kind of talked about this in the prior slide, but it works similarly on state level. We're not going to go into that detail here about each state, but essentially the Congress or the legislative body passes the law. At the federal level, it needs to pass, obviously, on the House side and the Senate side. Oftentimes there's a lot of debate because the House version of a particular bill may differ from the Senate version. And so reconciling that is a debate. If any of you remember, the strategy when the Affordable Care Act passed was that the House essentially adopted the Senate version of the bill in order to expedite the bill being passed. And then we talked about the administrative agency publishing the notice of proposed rules. But like I said, in the federal level, this timeline is usually 60 days. Different states will have different timelines, but there's generally a period where the proposed rule is proposed, there is comments. Once the proposed rule is made final and the final version is is published, there's usually like a waiting period. Sometimes it's 30 days, sometimes it's 60 days before the law is effective. And then during that time, the administrative agency will have reviewed all of the drafts of the rules, reviewed the comments, taken those into consideration. And usually what they will do in the final version is prepare like their comments to the comments, and they'll kind of group them because a lot of the comments will be similar. So they'll say several commenters have mentioned blah 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 blah, here's our response. So you can see what they're thinking, and then that final rule is published. All right, so the example that we're gonna focus on today is HIPAA and HITECH. If you've ever worked with a healthcare provider, you've definitely come across HIPAA and HITECH, probably together, in your work. If you haven't, something that you've heard of outside of your professional life, it gets a lot of attention. Some of you may recall there was a large breach by a company that received a lot of public or protected health information, that was called Change Healthcare. There was a recent breach a few months ago, maybe 4 months ago, I think it was, and it was huge. So some of you may have actually received notices about that. Like it was millions and millions of Americans. So some of you may be on that list, and we're going to talk about what that notice you received was, and so now you will know. So HIPAA, the law, is referring to the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act of 1996. It was in fact an action of Congress. Even though in 1996, I don't know how many of you guys remember that, but this was ginormous in the healthcare world. Ginormous. This was probably, with the exception of Medicare and Medicaid, probably one of the biggest pieces of healthcare legislation that passed. And so, I can say in my lifetime, this is probably one of the biggest changes that we've had. HIPAA was then amended by HITECH in 2009. And we really kind of refer to HIPAA and HITECH together. So if I say HIPAA moving forward in the presentation, I'm referring to them together. And that amended HIPAA by promoting the use of health information technology, or HIT, which by that point in 2009 was rapidly gaining momentum. So right now, we know most of our providers use electronic medical records. If you go to a hospital, you're definitely going to see that. Some of our smaller providers don't now, but in 2009, that was quickly gaining momentum, and we were realizing what the benefits of electronic medical records were at the time, and that prompted HITECH. So like I said, now you'll hear them referred to together. People just say HIPAA. They're probably talking about HIPAA and HITECH. So the regulations that you'll hear referred to with HIPAA are the HIPAA privacy rule and the HIPAA security rule. And, again, sometimes people just refer to it as HIPAA, but there's the privacy aspect and the security aspect, which we'll talk about. HIPAA is promulgated by the executive agency called the Department of Health and Human Services, and then the sub-agency is the Office of Civil Rights. So with the executive agencies, a lot of them are pretty big agencies that have sub-agencies and sub-agencies, and the organizational chart is bigger than, I would need like 10 screens to show you the entire organizational chart. for all of the agencies, as you can imagine. But so that we know we're in the Health Department of Health and Human Services and Office of Civil Rights. Okay. So who does HIPAA apply to? Who and what does HIPAA apply to? So HIPAA applies to information that is called protected health information, and that is any identifiable information created or received about an individual, including demographic data, physical or mental health condition, receipt of healthcare services, or payment for services. So that we're going to talk about what that includes specifically. And then to whom does that apply? HIPAA applies to healthcare providers, healthcare plans, healthcare clearinghouses. And then HIPAA also applies to a group of entities called business associates. And that is any entity that uses, discloses, creates, or obtains PHI in performing a function, activity, or service on behalf of the covered entity. So the business associates are usually other companies that contract with the covered entities to provide service. So sometimes it could be a technology company, if like the hospital is using a technology service to handle their billing, if they're using a service to transport or store, existing records or radiology films or things like that, that entity is most likely going to be a business associate of the hospital. So it encompasses a lot of entities, particularly when we go back to electronic medical records and understanding the capabilities that we have when records are stored electronically, particularly now that we've entered the world of AI, has significantly expanded the scope of what a business associate is or could be in the near future. So I mentioned the Change Healthcare breach. Change Healthcare is a business associate of several healthcare providers. So they're a pretty large company, and so they had worked with several providers in pretty much all 50 states, and that's why so many Americans were impacted by that particular breach. So what is PHI? So PHI are patient names, patient contact information, including their email address, their birthdays or dates of birth, their home addresses, phone numbers, test results, medical record numbers, admissions and discharge dates. Photographs are also considered to be PHI. Really, like anything that is related to that patient and that service would be considered PHI, even if outside of the healthcare context, we consider that information to be demographic. All right, so application of HIPAA, we talked about privacy, or we talked about the privacy and the security rules, which we'll talk a little bit about more. But also there's something called the minimum necessary rule. The minimum necessary rule relates to how much information you're sharing with a person or entity that you're sharing with. And as the name implies, you're required to only share the information that is necessary for that person to carry out their duties with respect to that patient. So there may be several other pieces of information about that patient that are not important for that particular exchange. The minimum necessary rule requires that we limit that to the best that we can. Confidentiality, which goes along with privacy, but I list it separately because a lot of times when we say the word confidentiality, that's as perceived by the patient. How the patient perceives that their information is being treated is also very important, particularly in today's environment. And then we have permitted disclosures. Permitted disclosures are instances where the covered entity is able to disclose information about a patient outside of their entity. So either to another provider, to an outside provider, or to some other third party, based on the exceptions and permissions that are in the HIPAA regulations and legislation. And then breaches. So, like I said, we mentioned the Change Healthcare breach. That was a pretty big one. They're not all necessarily that big. The breaches that you hear about on the news are breaches that are over 500 individuals. There are several breaches that occurred that are smaller than that. But once you impact 500 individuals, you are required to report that to the news outlet. So that's when why you hear some of these bigger ones coming up on the news. All right, so the HIPAA privacy rule. So the HIPAA privacy rule specifies circumstances in which a covered entity may use and disclose PHI, including when an individual's authorization is required for the entity to share PHI. So there are certain circumstances where the information can be shared without a patient's permission. And those certain circumstances are all detailed in HIPAA and the regulations. And then in other circumstances, the patient is required to sign a record release, which is sometimes referred to, or an authorization to share that PHI. The privacy rules also permit state laws to specify situations in which the health practitioners are required to report certain conditions to the state agency, which is called mandatory reporting. And we're going to work through a health department example with that one. I included a graphic that is a social media graphic. You probably recognize that, so that I can outline an example of the HIPAA privacy rule that has come across my desk several times. So I'm sure a lot of you have been on different websites, or maybe even Facebook pages. Like a doctor's office may have a Facebook page where they, just talk about different services they're offering. Or if a new doctor comes on, they'll say, hey, welcome, Dr. Smith, coming from Northwestern, etc. And just to kind of get their name out like any other business would. Well, sometimes when a doctor's office or a provider has social media, somebody who may or may not have been a patient will comment on the social media in a specific way. So not just saying, welcome, Dr. Smith, Pittsburgh is great. They'll say something along the lines of, when I was at this office last week, they were 2 hours behind, and I almost missed my next appointment because I was 2 hours late, or etc. And typically a business owner, if they run a restaurant or hotel, like, they may comment back and say, we're sorry that this happened. We hope that your next experience is better. Please come back, etc. Well, in the covered entity side of things, we can't really do that. We can't, comment on that. That's a violation of the HIPAA privacy rule, because if you comment back to the person and you say, we're sorry your visit didn't go well, essentially you're confirming that that person was a visitor or they were a patient, and that's a violation of the privacy rules. So that comes up a lot in my practice, which is somewhat unfortunate, but also understandable. But you may have seen that in your personal social media, or just in general. So just something to keep in mind. The HIPAA security rule defines appropriate organizational and technological safeguards to protect electronic PHI. This includes passwords and encryption. This is really important because this is essentially what the organization is doing to prevent a breach of PHI. Organizational safeguards include policies and procedures. So typically when we say organizational safeguards, we're talking about policies and procedures and compliance. When we say technical safeguards, that's when we're talking about encryptions, passwords, um, two-step notification, things like that. So for example, if an organization has a clean desk policy, meaning that when you leave for the day, your workstation has to be free and clear of all extraneous papers on your desk and things like that, that would be an organizational safeguard that they are taking to make sure that PHI is protected. Because even though we're all, maybe they're all electronic medical records, there's still printouts, there's still people writing notes on sticky notes and things like that. Like that still happens. So that would be an example of an organizational safeguard. Passwords and encryption are of utmost importance now. And going back to the breaches, one thing that's important to know is if there is PHI that is breached and is somehow released, if that PHI is encrypted and it is unreadable and unusable, it is not subject to the breach notification rule. So organizations are, or they should be, placing a high priority on making sure that information is encrypted to any individuals who are outside of that organization. So we're gonna talk about the public health exception. So the public health exception permits reporting patients' PHI to the State Department for the limited purpose of public health surveillance. So we're gonna give an example, which is my county, which is Allegheny County. And so providers are required to report case positives of certain communicable and some non-communicable, but usually it's communicable diseases that occur at their practice that they are, that they are the provider of record for. And every health department jurisdiction has a process. I recently learned that our county has gone completely electronic. When I was in practice, at the clinic that I worked in, we were still on paper. And they've recently gone 100% electronic, and it seems like a pretty provider, usually user-friendly process, which is a good thing for public health. We saw a lot of this during the COVID pandemic. I know my county reported its COVID numbers out during the height of the pandemic daily. And so having, a system that was easy to report was obviously important during COVID, but those benefits can carry over to other diseases that are, endemic and occurring. So yeah, we'll kind of just go through this example, and I gave a list of the different reportable diseases. So this is a list, and I'm not going to read it, but I'll let you all kind of just go through it and get a list of the diseases that are reportable within 24 hours in Allegheny County. 24 hours of the provider getting the result back. And then that way the county can, monitor how frequently these are occurring, and if there is a possibility of, those diseases becoming an epidemic, or if there's clusters occurring in the county, they can get that information in real time. Like I said, COVID basically brought a lot of awareness to this process, because prior to this, I don't think a lot of individuals who were outside of healthcare even knew this existed, even though this has been going on the whole time. All right, and then there's an additional diseases that are reportable within 24 hours. And this is, again, very important in both the county level surveillance and the state level surveillance. And those entities, they talk very frequently, and like neighboring counties talk very frequently. Even if maybe Allegheny County is electronic, but like our neighboring county is still on paper. They still kind of make sure that they are aware of what's going on in each, because people travel from county to county. Some people work in one and live in another, etc. Okay, so this is just a fun little graphic. Don't worry, your information will be kept strictly confidential between you, me, the residents, the nurses, the staff, people in our marketing department, research, people in our billing department, people at our transcription company, people at our record archive, and people at your insurer, and my cat. So the cat's a little bit of a joke, but within this little comic, you can identify the business associate. So the business associate is the transcription company. And then there's several other people named in this comic that are probably just employees at the hospital, which it looks like they are. So, and kind of all kidding aside, while HIPAA does protect your health information, there's your information is still out there. The information is still out there. And various states have enacted additional protections for some types of information, which we talk about, I think, in the next slide. But just to, kind of give you a sense that, health, a lot of our information is out there, whether it's our health information or our personal identifiable information. When we go to buy something at Starbucks, they have our personal identifiable information as well. Oh wait, I guess I didn't have an example. Sorry. I thought I had another slide about HIPAA, but that's okay. I think we probably for the interest of time have to move to the next topic anyways, but happy to answer questions related to HIPAA at the end. Okay, so for HIPAA, we talked about the executive agency that promulgates regulations related to HIPAA, which was the Department of Health and Human Services, and specifically the sub-agency of the Office of Civil Rights. Another agency that is really important in public health is the Food and Drug Administration. And I prepared this presentation before I knew about the red dye ban that occurred today. So this is very timely. But the Food and Drug Administration influences a lot of what we do, specifically in my practice. We do work with a lot of startup companies that are interested in producing drugs and medical devices, and all of that is governed by the Food and Drug Administration. Just to give you an idea of the scope of an executive agency, specifically, the Food and Drug Administration is another part of the Department of Health and Human Services, part of the executive branch. The FDA is led by a commissioner of food and drugs and the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Both of those positions are appointed positions. They are appointed by the president. So those positions are what we call, quote unquote, political positions, meaning that when there's a new president coming in, that person is usually out. And the new president coming in, regardless if it's the same party or not, they are going to appoint an individual that aligns with their particular values and their particular agenda setting. So that's why you see changes in these positions. Other government positions within the agencies are not political positions. They are not lifetime appointments, but they are professional positions and they remain for several presidencies. In fiscal year 2022, the FDA had a budget of $8.4 billion, and that includes funds that were designated with them by Congress, and also includes funds that they received by pharma through user fees. The FDA is headquartered in White Oak, Maryland, which is close to DC, and they oversight of over $2.7 trillion in consumption products, which we're going to talk about which products those are. And then within the FDA, there are a lot of other sub offices and centers. Again, the organizational tree would take up like 10 screens, but one that you'll encounter if you do any clinical research is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, sometimes pronounced CDER. So what is regulated by the FDA? So we mentioned what, like over $2.7 trillion in products. So drugs for human use, medical devices for human use, biological products for human use, including vaccines, infant formulas, food and color additives, electronic products, cosmetics. And I have a question mark under medical marijuana because, as we talked about, there is a very, very current debate going on about the scheduling of marijuana. If you've been following the recent news, President Biden did make a recommendation for consideration of the scheduling of marijuana. So it's possible that in some point in the near future that medical marijuana may be regulated by the FDA. But at the moment, no, but future possibly. Here are just some examples of the different products. You can see there are several prescription drugs, infant formula, toothpaste, and then the lower right-hand picture is a picture of a stent, which is classified as a medical device. What about supplements? We hear and see a lot about supplements. Some of us may even use them personally, or have used them as a kid personally, at the case with like multivitamins. So the supplements themselves are actually not regulated by the FDA. However, there is oversight and very much monitoring and surveillance of the advertisements and promotional materials of supplements. As you can see here, this is an example of a label for a melatonin supplement. And you can see the different language on the label. And the language is very important so that it is not considered a drug from the supplement manufacturer perspective. And the FDA and the FTC very much monitor these things. So that could be a separate presentation, but just to kind of plant that seed that supplements are not under that category. Okay, so that's the executive branch. We wanted to talk about the judicial branch as well. As we mentioned before, the judicial branch interprets laws. It resolves disputes between various parties. Very important part about the judicial branch, the party bringing the suit, also known as the plaintiff, must have standing to do so. What that means is that the plaintiff must have essentially an interest in the case to do so. And this is a matter of constitutional law, so we're not necessarily going to get into all of this, but if a plaintiff can't just necessarily say, oh, I don't like that law, I'm going to sue the government about it, if you have kind of no personal stake in the law. And there's a lot of cases that where the plaintiff will map out its personal stake, and then that has to get argued between the parties itself. But that's essentially what that means, and that's referred to as having standing to bring the case. And the courts play an important role not only in the interpretation of the laws, but the interpretation of the agency regulations. Some examples of two cases that came about after the Affordable Care Act. We have Little Sisters of the Poor, St. Peter's and Paul Home versus Pennsylvania. Sometimes that's just referred to as Little Sisters of the Poor. And then Burwell versus Hobby Lobby stores in 2014. Both of those cases involved the requirement under the Affordable Care Act for employers to cover contraception for their employees under their employee health insurance plan. Several interest groups and employers who strongly identified with a certain religion were opposed to that requirement, and they sued. These cases are viewed as two cases that do essentially limit that requirement and give organizations that are either considered to be religious organizations or small, closely held companies to waive that requirement. And essentially, how it works in practice now is individuals who work for those organizations have an opportunity to maintain their contraceptive coverage essentially through the government. But the employers themselves are not participating in that coverage plan, if that makes sense. So these are kind of the two cases that interpreted the that particular provision of the Affordable Care Act. Okay. So um we're just going to kind of talk about at a high level, not necessarily specific cases, but how different portions of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution come into public health. I mean, for the exam, this is where you're probably going to see some questions about the different, the different Bill of Rights that you hear normally in discussion, but how they relate to public health. So the Fourth Amendment is protection against unreasonable search and seizure. We normally hear about that, about police coming to people's houses or their cars and searching, which is all true. But in public health, that can mean several different things. So when we talk about PHI, protected health information, law enforcement cannot obtain PHI without a warrant and probable cause, which is, true for other types of property, but PHI does fall into that. As I mentioned, there are additional protections that come from federal or state law that are related to protection of information about mental health and substance abuse treatment, also HIV/AIDS and reproductive health information. The last one, reproductive health information, is a relatively new provision that comes from the regulations that protects information about people's reproductive health as a result of the recent Supreme Court decision. An application of the First Amendment in public health is related to licensed businesses, as they are subject to warrantless inspections to enforce safety standards pursuant to the regulations of the licensing agencies. So in public health, we could be talking about providers, but also we could be talking about restaurants, bars, medical marijuana dispensaries. I mentioned medical marijuana with some of the different state laws and scheduling of THC, but medical marijuana dispensaries are often licensed entities in the state, and so they are subject to additional requirements with respect to searches and seizures, just like a restaurant would be, or a bar would be, or anything like that, or a pharmacy. We'll often hear about the 10th Amendment in public health, which enables the states to exercise all the powers that are neither given to the federal government nor prohibited by the Constitution. So that's where we get a lot of the patchwork state laws, where states are acting in areas that the federal government has not acted, and they're creating their own regulations and laws that are specific to their population. And some of those things may be because of the natural resources in the state, some of the difference in demographics of the state, but that's where you get that from. Importantly, states also possess the powers within their borders to impose quarantine and isolation. And this essentially comes from a very, very old case called Gibbons versus Ogden. But we saw this play out in real time during the COVID pandemic, when we had quarantines and travel restrictions and things of that nature. And there were, several arguments that were brought forth that both included 10th Amendment claims as well as First Amendment claims, the freedom of, which would either be under the freedom of speech or expression of religion, when it came to some of the COVID restrictions that we all very much remember from a few years ago. Okay. The police powers are the coercive powers of the state to enact laws and disseminate regulations to protect the public and to promote the common good. States may pass laws designed to promote public health, safety, and the welfare of its residents, which is where we get a lot of our laws related to environmental protections at the state level, protections related to children and adolescent health, etc. States may infringe on autonomy, which is the which is the ability to be free from external influence over independent decision making. And so we'll talk a little bit about autonomy when we talk about ethics. Okay, practice question. The US interpreted the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution to give the states police powers to pursue public health initiatives that protect general welfare. However, differences in such initiatives persist across the states because police powers prohibit states from defining standards of care and require the state government to do so. Standards of care are applied by police powers, but implementation is left to the states. Police powers permit each state the right to define and delegate authority and responsibility for public health services. States use police powers to fund public health services only through property taxes, and these vary from state to state.
I'll leave it open for another minute. We only have
Okay.
about half the responses.
Gotcha.
So we have about 72% saying C.
All right. Yay. All right. Congratulations. Police powers permit each state the right to define and delegate authority and responsibility for public health services. So I think this one goes back to, picking the best answer. We can probably, look at D or 4, public health services only through property taxes, and these vary from state to state. Not necessarily true. Some states may use practices, may use property taxes to fund certain services, but that's not necessarily across the board. And then standards of care are applied by police powers, but the implementations are left to the state. Typically, that's not the case where like a standard of care is, mandated by the federal government. So that's why that one would not be the best answer. And then police powers prohibit the states from defining the standards of care. That one isn't the case either. So I think the standards of care one, we could probably eliminate those, and then that leaves us with number 3 or C. Okay, so we're gonna kind of go over this relatively quickly. Isolation, which we all know, and quarantine, are two distinct types of tools that the government has, both essentially used during the COVID pandemic. One of the things that I want to emphasize on this slide, and just kind of go to the bottom in the interest of time, is the typical requirement of due process that is required generally, and that usually would involve a court hearing of some sort. We saw this play out during the COVID pandemic in a very kind of interesting and quick moving way. But if you ever see the term due process in a question, they are referring to a court hearing opportunity where both sides have a chance to present their sides of the argument. Okay, so tools to enforce public health laws and regulations. We have inspections, licensing, and nuisance abatement, which are, three of the examples that you may come across. There's probably certainly others, or other interpretations. So inspections, you hear a lot about this with restaurants and bars, where they come in and there may be an issue with with cleanliness in the restaurant or anything like that. And then there's some of those inspections are scheduled, some of them are random, where the inspector just shows up as a result of a complaint. The owner doesn't know they're coming, and then they get in trouble. Licensing, a lot of my work involves licensing and various providers, doctors, nurses, hospitals in the vast majority of states are required to go through licensing, in which they have to meet certain requirements in order to be able to practice in that state. And there are certain requirements to maintain that license over time. Nuisance abatement comes up a lot in the environmental scheme. Typically, the government is limited in what it requires its property owners to do. However, if a condition of the property is causing harm to others, meaning neighbors or other passerbyers, the government has the ability to require that property owner to rectify that particular situation. Sometimes you'll see homes or old storefronts be condemned because that creates a safety issue for those around it. Okay, so we have a break scheduled, but in the interest of time, maybe we'll do like 2 questions, maybe, Ashley. Does that work?
Yeah, that works great.
Okay.
Okay. So let's see. So the first question is, can individuals or entities be charged with a crime for not obeying regulations or only with legislation?
So yes, so individuals and entities can be charged criminally depending on the regulation. So the actual law would have to specify if there was criminal liability associated with non-compliance, and if there could be individual liability, or is it just the organization. So it could be either or.
Okay. So then the other question is, laws and regulations were defined, but then you spoke about rules. Could you define rules?
Oh yes, good question. Sorry. So usually, rules and regulations are sometimes used synonymously. So if you hear someone say the interim final rule or a final rule, they're referring to the regulation. Good question. All right. So the next sessions are not as long, so we should be good on time. Okay. So ethics. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. So by Potter Stewart, which, if it were only always that simple, but as academics, we know it is not always that simple, and there's lots of analysis involved. So here we go. All right, so ethics in public health law. So public health ethics examines what practices make good conduct and the right course of action in a particular situation. So there's a few things that you have to kind of recognize right off the top of that. And not everyone necessarily, from all different stakeholder groups is going to agree. But for the purposes of public health and, within the sphere of public health, this is where we stand. So we recognize a right to health and basic human rights. Going back to the legal side, that does not mean that public health is a constitutional right. But from an ethics standpoint, that's our starting point. We must account for the social context, which may change over time. And sometimes there's no right answer. So the last 2 points really make the study of ethics and public health law very, very interesting, particularly the changes that occur over time. So, even when I was in grad school for public health, a lot of our conversations are very different. Technology has changed a lot of what we consider in ethics and public health. And, we talked about HIPAA and HITECH and how that changed in response to the advances in healthcare technology. And now we're talking about AI. So, we don't know how AI is going to influence public health ethics in the next 5 years. Okay. So the UN, United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights Principles encompass freedom, equality, equal protection under the law, and the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself or herself and their family. So this is, again, a starting point of ethics. And this is a declaration that was internationally adopted, not necessarily adopted by the Congress of the United States. But when we talk about public health and we're in the public health sphere, again, this is where we start. So right to health being a general ethical principle, the American Public Health Association Code of Ethics states as such. And so when we enter our debates, this is again where we start. We prioritize the social determinants of health and health in all policies. So I mentioned before that there are policies that don't appear to impact health, like policies about education, special education, things like that. But we all know that there's going to be a downstream or an upstream impact that is related to a person's health. So social determinants of health and public health law. They are the conditions in the environments where people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risk. So this could include economic stability, education access and quality, healthcare access and quality, neighborhood and built community, social and community context. I'm not going to go into details about those because those will be covered in a different session, the social and behavioral health. But what we want to do here is make those connections to the proposed policies and law. So I picked a quote, lived experiences also need to be understood in the context of individual and structural social determinants of health. And so I think that's really important. We mentioned when laws are being proposed and stakeholders have an opportunity to share their perspectives, we want to think about who those stakeholders are and are the marginalized voices being amplified in those stakeholder discussions. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, that's not the case. And so what I see as our role moving forward is to elevate those voices that have been either historically marginalized or who are marginalized, and what are their lived experiences. And when we are in the position to propose a policy or to influence a policy, are we thinking about those? Are we considering those? We might not win every time, but in my mind, it is a victory if that voice that was not able to be heard is heard because of you and because you recognize that issue and you were able to connect that issue to the policy. Related concepts include health disparities, the disproportionate risk of disease faced by some groups, fundamental causes of disease, environmental conditions, occupational exposures, genetics or lifestyle, and the egalitarian principle. But public health intervention should ensure equal protection as all people are equal. Again, health disparities will be discussed in detail in the social and behavioral health section, but we want to make those connections with the overarching policies. Here's a practice question. Income, interpersonal stress, and education level are all examples of blank, which determine the overall health and quality of life of our communities. Physical determinants, spatial determinants, environmental determinants, or social determinants. We have everybody just about, Ashley.
Yeah, we can close this one. All right,
Okay, all
here,
right.
social determinants of health.
That is correct. Oh, it looks like most people got that one, which is
Yeah.
good. Okay. Um, we also want to talk about some of these concepts which also overlap to behavioral health. So we're not going to spend too much time on them, and we want to cover ethics as well. Social justice, which is the fair and equitable and appropriate treatment in light of what is fair or due or owed to the groups. I want to make a connection between this concept and what we talked about throughout the presentation regarding the marijuana scheduling. President Biden referred to the social justice aspect when he made his pardons related to marijuana convictions. So keeping that in mind, it's really amazing how all of these concepts are intertwined in some way. Distributive justice, just allocation of benefits. So that's an important one when we think about various policies related to taxation and different experimental drugs that may become available. Are those being allocated where they're needed? And environmental justice, fair treatment of all people in the application of public health policy that reduces the disparity and exposure to environmental contamination. Okay, so steps in ethical decision making. So number one would be analyzing the ethical issue, evaluating the ethical dimension that various public health options, and providing justification for one particular public health action. We talked a lot about the different stakeholders and issues and how different lived experiences come into the process. So this would be the steps in your analysis. So what are the different perspectives? And I want to highlight that it's really important to consider the opposing perspective. There's always an opposing perspective, and it's really important to think about who is the other person. Even I'm a lawyer, so I have a client, so I know who I have to advocate for. As a policymaker, you don't have a client per se, but that makes it even more important to think about what is the opposing viewpoint than the one that I'm arguing, and understanding that viewpoint. And including all of the different elements that we talked about in ethics in that particular analysis. And then in the end, when you come out with your decision, can you kind of check all of those boxes that you considered that? And if you can, you usually come out with a better decision. Even if not everybody agrees, if you can check all those boxes and say, we considered X, Y, and Z, and we considered how to equally distribute the risk and benefits, you're probably going to come out with a pretty good decision, even if not everybody is completely on board. Okay, so public health research ethical concepts. often you'll hear reference the Belmont report, which is kind of like the hallmark document for research ethics. The three concepts discussed in the Belmont report: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So respect for persons comes into play by treating research participants as autonomous agents and obtaining informed consent to participating in research. A lot of my work involves drafting consents for research projects to make sure that the participants understand what they are agreeing to participate in. Beneficence, protecting the well-being of each research participant and ensure that the benefits outweigh the risk. Sometimes research projects need to be terminated because the benefits do not outweigh the risk. And so at that point, our only ethical option is to discontinue the study and move forward in a different way. And justice, the benefits and the burden should be distributed fairly, which is distributive justice, as we talked about before, and that the affected groups have the opportunity to participate in the decision making, which is procedural justice. And this is becoming more and more prevalent in research as we try to include the impacted group in that decision, whether that's through qualitative research designs or through kind of informal market type research. Okay, so I'll just go through, Ashley, I'll just go through this one so we can kind of get to the next couple slides. Sure. When conducting a research study, which of the following is a unique requirement when the study involves human subjects or participants? Securing enough funding for the project, reporting only the data that strengthens support of the hypothesis, or ensuring that all participants receive an incentive upon completion of data collection, obtaining a waiver or approval from an institutional review board or IRB prior to the start of the study. Okay, so I see some action in the chat. And it looks like everybody kind of is leaning towards 4, so that's good. So obtaining the waiver from the IRB prior to the start of the study is essential to conducting human subjects research. Okay, so broad theories of ethics in public health, utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number of people, liberalism, which is individuals' rights and freedom to choose, and communitarianism. Individuals are inseparable from their communities. So I think in all of the concepts of public health, there are elements of each one of these. Maybe not, all one or all the other, but I think with each debate, you have to think about all of these. What comes to mind to me with are, like neighborhood, very much local issues, for example. So issues that impact the environmental characteristics of the neighborhood, water quality, things like that. So all of the ethical theories can apply to any of the types of laws and regulations that we've talked about today. Okay. This is similar to what we just talked about with the graphic, so we can kind of skip over that one. Okay, so building community trust. This is a concept that encompasses ethics, encompasses policy making, but really is characteristic of what a good community leader would be doing, whether you're officially in a policy making position or you're a stakeholder or somewhere in between. Setting priorities, reciprocity, fiduciary duty, kind of understanding your place and your priorities in that position versus your personal priorities, conflicts of interest, and transparency. So conflicts of interest come up a lot, particularly, when you're working within the community, because everybody has their individual aspirations and their individual goals, and maybe that conflict of interest is financial, maybe it's interpersonal, but identifying that up front is a way to manage that. And there are several instances if you're working at a healthcare provider or a school, that you're required to disclose that. But even when you're not necessarily required by law to disclose conflicts of interest, it's really important to be aware of those and make those known up front and by being transparent. Okay, we're gonna skip the break in the interest of time, obviously. So now it's just practice question. Oh, wait, hold on. Okay, so now it's just practice questions. Ashley, we'll just do as many as we can.
Sure.
Do you want to do that until we're at time?
Yeah, we do have two comments in the questions. Do you want to go
Okay, yeah, let's
first?
do let's do
Yeah.
let's take a break to do those and then we'll get started in the question.
Okay. All right. So the first one is, are all agencies under HHS, are all agencies under HHS under the executive branch? For example, the FDA, CDC.
Yes, yeah. So all of the HHS agents, so the HHS itself is under the executive branch, and then all of the sub agencies and sub agencies also fall under the executive branch.
And then this other one was just clarification on the melatonin example. Does the
Mhm.
FDA regulate or not regulate supplements? They were confused by the melatonin
That's a good question. Yeah. So the FDA does not regulate they do not regulate substances or supplements. I'm
supplements.
sorry.
Yeah.
Um, um, however, they are very active in monitoring advertisements and publicly available information that supplement companies either put on their website or their social media. And they do issue citations for supplement companies that are holding themselves out like they're prescription drugs.
Yeah. All right. So that's that. So if you want to do a couple practice questions,
Yeah, we'll just do as many as we can. We'll just go
yeah.
like that.
Okay.
Okay. Um, a public health department government employee manages that department's non-infectious conditions epidemiology program. The program's recent report on a traffic accident deaths have attracted attention. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, a non-profit incorporation, has asked that person to simultaneously take a leadership role in MAD's program to oversee fundraising activities and promote compliance with laws about drinking and driving. Would it be ethical for this person to accept MAD's offer of simultaneous employment? And then I'll let you guys read the question options.
I'll leave it open for about 10 more seconds just so we can get through a couple more. So get your best guesses in. All right. So here we go. This one, can you see the results?
Yes. So yes, provided the outside activity is not operated within the government agency and the employee does not incur conflicts of interest, divulge confidential information, nor receive special privileges or benefits. Oh wait, what was the second most popular answer? Because this one's a little bit tricky.
Yeah, so we had C was our most, D was our second, and then A was the first.
Gotcha. Okay. Um, so so we'll talk about D real quick. So no, for ethical reasons, government employees generally are banned from simultaneously taking senior leadership in business. So typically, so this one I think is probably a little bit tricky. I could see why this one was a popular choice. But the way the question read, it it wasn't necessarily implying a business per se. So I would say that's why I would pick A as the best answer. But this one was a little bit tricky.
Yeah, and Maria made a good comment that I probably didn't give you enough time to really thoroughly read this one.
Yeah, no, this one was really long. So
Yeah.
if the next one is long, we'll skip to a shorter one and the answers
Okay.
are fine.
That sounds good.
Okay. Hold on.
Yeah, the next one looks like it's shorter.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry about that. When making decisions, public health leaders face the ethical challenge of ignoring the rights and liberties of those individuals affected by the disease, creating maximum benefit for all while minimizing individual harm, maximizing resource expenditures, and demanding trust from public healthcare providers serving patients.
Okay, I'm gonna end this one because it looks like we've got a lot of responses and there's a really solid
There's
B.
a really solid,
Yeah, really solid.
yay, B.
Yeah,
Okay,
good job on that one.
awesome. Good job. All right. We'll do the same thing with the next one. If it's long, we'll skip. Um, we'll do this one just because we didn't really cover this one. We just want you to know about it. Which of the following historical events raised awareness of the need for protection of research subjects and resulted in the 1947 creation of the International Code of Ethics for Research?
And I pay very close attention to the year on this one. We've
Yeah.
done this one in the past, and I know that's what trips people up. So,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
yeah.
See why.
All right, I'm gonna leave it open 10 more seconds. Okay.
So the answer is A, the Nazi human experimentation. Thus, Ashley's comments about the year is what I was assuming you're referring to, right,
Yeah.
Ashley?
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think if without the year, D would probably be a guess that I would probably make.
Yeah, and it's also the International Code of Ethics. So,
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's the other clue on that one. So um yeah. All right. We'll try to get a couple more short ones in. Wait. Okay. All right. This one's short, right? The answers are short. Okay. Which of the following United States federal laws prohibits a public health practitioner from sharing individually identifiable health information on a public health department computer system? Okay. Well, we talked extensively about this one, so
yes, and we're coming in with a very solid answer again. So,
okay.
everyone got this one, oh, 98
Okay.
got it right. So,
And
yes.
then if I'm correct on the exam, you may see it written out all the way, or you may just see HIPAA, right?
Yeah, so
It's
usually on
dependent.
the exam, you would see like in the parentheses, or you'd see it written out, or you could see both. So yeah, know
Yeah.
what it stands for, know the abbreviation.
Yeah. Especially for that one. That's a big one.
Mhm.
All
Yeah.
right. All right. Let's try to get one more in. Okay. This one's a little long. Do you want to skip to the next one?
Yeah, why don't you just show the answer so everyone can see it? Because if they watch the video, they can come back.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
The
There we
answer to that one is A. Okay. Are the answers to this one short? I can't see the
Yeah,
answers. I
yeah,
can't
they're
remember.
just
Okay. All right. The management of a healthcare facility requires staff to adhere to ethical principles and provide culturally appropriate care. The institution of these values is most likely to influence which of the following aspects of healthcare provided by this facility. Do we want to go to this one? Go to the answer on this one?
Yep, I'm gonna just give it a couple more seconds because it looks like
Okay, no problem.
we've got a couple in the running right now.
Awesome. Okay, okay.
All right, I'm gonna give you just 5 more seconds. Okay. It's kind of between A, B, and C, but C was the one that had the most.
Gotcha. Okay. So the answer for this one is A. This one, I feel like we've had a lot of discussion about this one. However, I think that A is the right answer because of process of elimination. Is the best answer that I can come up with as to why A is the correct answer. Um, I could make a strong argument for B as well. Um, but the answer, I would say it's probably not. This I know actually we've had a lot of discussions about
Yeah,
this one
yeah,
being A, but I could see the correct answer being A or B. And I feel like this exact answer in questions would be unlikely to show up, but understanding the analysis is what's important.
yeah, yeah. All right, so that we are out of time. We got through the majority of the questions today. So
Yeah.
I know that this topic can be challenging for some people who don't live in the US, just understanding the different laws and stuff. And so I'd say definitely pay attention to what Medicare is, Medicaid, HIPAA, and Melissa did a good job going all over all of those things. And so when I send out the links, I'll just send like a little brief overview for that for you too. So I hope that everyone has enjoyed this week's sessions. We'll be back next week on Tuesday. And I want to say a special thank you to Melissa for being here today. And we will hopefully see everyone next week.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great afternoon. I enjoyed presenting this topic, and good luck on the exam. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your sessions.
All right. Thanks. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye.